Welcome to this explainer. Okay, let's dive into this. Imagine stepping completely out of your everyday waking life and opening your eyes to the warm, flickering glow of a gas-lit parlor. This is the summoning room. It's this incredible space draped in rich velvet and polished mahogany where the veil between worlds is, well, deliberately thinned. Our source material today takes us on a totally fascinating journey with a character named Charles Farrington. He uses this magical realism setting to literally conjure up the master of horror himself, Stephen King, to explore the anatomy of fear through a really creative lens.
So to bridge the gap between reality and the world of storytelling, Charles uses a physical anchor. In this case, it's a single tarnished key ripped from an old manual typewriter. It's the perfect, heavy little piece of a literary engine to summon a writer, right? Clutching this key in front of an ornate mirror, Charles recites his invocation dream spell. He turns this unique 2-hourglass to track the dream's limits, and suddenly the mirror stops reflecting the room. It becomes this swirling vortex of shadows. We get these fleeting, entirely unsettling glimpses: a child's bicycle, a red balloon, gleaming eyes in the dark, perfectly setting the stage for the arrival of an absolute icon.
Section 1. Inside the summoning room. Right out of those swirling shadows, Stephen King actually solidifies. And he looks deceptively ordinary, just hanging out in a rumpled shirt. He happily accepts a spectral ice-cold cola before settling right down into a plush leather armchair. Which brings us to Section 2, Monsters in the Mundane. So, the crucial point is what King reveals about fear next.
With our guests comfortable, Charles poses the million-dollar question. What is it about the ordinary, everyday world that makes it such fertile ground for fear? And this brilliantly illustrates King's core philosophy. He entirely rejects the idea that horror has to be distant or exotic. Look, traditional horror often relies on exactly that. We're talking about the monster hiding under the bed, or the vampire isolated in some faraway crumbling castle in Transylvania. It's scary, for sure, but it's safely removed from our daily reality. King's horror? It completely flips the script. His monsters live in the house next door. They thrive in quiet little towns. They breed right in the darkest corners of the human heart.
It turns out the mundane is actually the perfect camouflage. King points out that when we're in familiar surroundings, we feel safe. So the absolute peak of horror happens when that bubble of safety is violently disrupted. When the mundane suddenly turns monstrous, it forces this chilling realization on you: oh wow, this could happen to me, in my own home, with my own family. That is the kind of fear that doesn't just startle you for a second, it gets right under your skin and lingers way after you've closed the book.
Section 3. Trauma behind the tales. Because it's one thing to talk about mundane horror in theory, but it's a whole other thing to see how it operates as a structural foundation of massive pop culture phenomena. To prove this philosophy, the explainer breaks down some of King's most legendary stories. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how clearly the supernatural hook is separated from the true horror. Take The Shining. The supernatural threat? A haunted hotel. But the real, visceral human trauma is a man battling severe addiction, spiraling family dysfunction, and just completely losing his grip on reality. The ghosts are literally what King calls the icing on a very dark cake. Or look at It. The threat is an evil, shape-shifting clown. But the core story is actually about childhood trauma, the unspoken dread we bury deep down, and the fears we're forced to carry into adulthood. The supernatural threat is merely the face we put on our internal, mundane monsters.
Let's dive a little deeper into Carrie to see how this works. According to King in this conjured conversation, Carrie White was simply a vessel. The story isn't fundamentally about telekinetic powers at all. It's actually a conduit for the rage and pain society inflicts on its outcasts. It showcases the casual, everyday cruelty of high school teenagers. It highlights the terrifying fanaticism of an abusive mother. And most chillingly, it reveals a community completely willing to turn a blind eye until it's entirely too late. The telekinesis isn't just some gimmick for jump scares, it's a megaphone. It gives the oppressed a terrible, destructive voice. Even William, Charles's quirky pet parrot in the summoning room, quips that it sounds like a real party, which is kind of funny, but it really just acknowledges just how heavy and dark these human themes truly are.
Moving right along to Section 4, The Craft of Conjuring. Having explored the what and why of King's horror, Charles shifts the focus to the how. Like, how does an author maintain such relentless, prolific creativity over literally decades? What exactly is going on inside the mind of the writer as they actively try to terrify us?
Well, King describes his writing not as some grand act of architectural invention, but almost as a compulsion, driven by what he calls the fossil metaphor. He genuinely believes that stories are essentially pre-existing entities. They're already out there, buried in the dirt, just waiting to be found. So the writer's job isn't to build a story from scratch, but simply to act as an excavator, to carefully dig the fossil up, delicately clean it off, and present it to the world. And the hardest trick, he notes, is just getting your own ego out of the way so the story can tell itself.
Let's move to and see how this builds into his actual day-to-day process. King operates on this incredibly famous two-part rule. Step 1. Write with the door closed. What does that mean? It means you write for yourself, keeping the story entirely raw, unfiltered, and honest. You don't worry about what the critics or the readers will think. Then, Step 2. Rewrite with the door open. Once that raw fossil is safely out of the ground, you invite the world in. You edit, you polish, and you clean it up so the audience can clearly see the terrifying shape of what you've unearthed.
But how do you know when that fossil is actually ready? What's the metric for success here? For King, it all comes down to the ultimate test. He admits to Charles that sometimes, late at night when he's deep in the trenches of a manuscript, the things he's writing about begin to feel a little too real. In fact, a literal shiver passes through his spectral form as he says it. That genuine fear is the hallmark of a great story. When the horrific elements of a mundane reality scare the writer sitting safely at their desk, well, you know without a doubt, it's going to terrify the reader.
As King shares these final pieces of wisdom, the temporal limits of this magical encounter are finally reached. The last grains of sand tumble through the 2-hourglass on the mantelpiece. Recognizing their time is up, King gives a final, knowing smile. His comfortable clothes fade, his spectral form grows translucent, and he just slowly dissolves back into the shadows, leaving only the faint scent of old paper behind. The summoning room itself begins to dim, and Charles feels the gentle pull of the waking world. He opens his eyes in his own bed, the morning light filtering in, with the cool metal of that old typewriter key resting right on his chest. And his immediate reaction? He reaches straight for his journal, completely energized and inspired to capture the chilling wisdom he just experienced.
Which leaves us with this final, incredibly resonant thought from the master himself. Never, ever underestimate the power of a good, simple scare. It's honestly a perfect summary of everything we've unpacked today. The most profound terror doesn't require elaborate monsters or distant galaxies. It just requires a mirror held up to our own lives. So as you go about your day today, look around your safe, comfortable spaces and ask yourself, what simple, everyday things are perfectly camouflaging the next great scare? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and definitely keep your eyes open.